They said no one would survive a night like that. Not out on the open highway with the wind screaming across the plains and the snow falling sideways like the sky itself had lost its way. But sometimes the quietest moments of kindness begin in storms that should have ended everything. The blizzard had rolled across northern Colorado just after dusk, swallowing the highway mile by mile, until even the road signs disappeared behind curtains of white. Most people had the good sense to stay home that night. Ethan Walker didn't. His old Ford pickup pushed slowly through the drifting snow, headlights cutting two narrow tunnels through the storm as he made the long drive back toward the small cabin he shared with his 8-year-old daughter, Emily. Ethan had lived through enough winters to know when a storm meant trouble, but he also knew that a late shift at the auto shop meant bills got paid and groceries stayed on the table. The heater in the truck hummed weakly, fighting the cold that crept in through every seam of the aging doors. Outside, the wind howled across the frozen fields, rattling the truck hard enough that Ethan tightened his grip on the steering wheel. He had driven this stretch of road 1,000 times, 12 lonely miles between the town garage and the edge of Pine Hollow where his cabin waited beside a line of bare cottonwood trees. Normally the drive took 20 minutes. Tonight it felt like crossing another world. Then something unusual caught his eye. Just ahead, barely visible through the snow, a shape sat crooked near the shoulder of the road. Ethan slowed, squinting through the swirling white. A car. Small. Half buried already. Its hazard lights blinked faintly through the storm, each orange flash struggling against the wind like a signal from somewhere far away. Most drivers might have kept going. The storm was getting worse, and out here help could take hours. But Ethan had never been the kind of man who passed someone in trouble. He eased the truck onto the shoulder, tires crunching through packed snow until the engine idled beside the stranded vehicle. The wind slammed against the door the moment he opened it, biting through his coat as he stepped out. Snow whipped across the highway, stinging his face as he moved toward the car. The driver's door hung slightly open, its edge creaking in the wind. Ethan leaned down and looked inside, and what he saw made the world go strangely quiet despite the storm raging around him. In the back seat sat a young woman wrapped in a thin blanket, her arms cradling two tiny newborn babies pressed close against her chest. The babies were bundled in mismatched layers of clothing, their small faces red from the cold as faint cries rose above the whistle of the wind. The woman looked barely conscious, her eyes half closed, her breath slow and fragile in the freezing air. For a moment Ethan simply stood there, snow collecting on his shoulders, trying to understand how anyone could end up here in the middle of a blizzard with two newborn twins and nowhere left to go. Then one of the babies made a soft sound, the kind that only a helpless child makes when the world is too big and too cold. Ethan didn't hesitate. He reached for the door, his voice calm despite the storm. "Hey there," he said gently, as if the wind itself might listen. "You're not staying out here tonight." And in that moment, without realizing it, Ethan Walker stepped into a story that would change every quiet corner of his life. Ethan moved quickly, because in weather like this hesitation could turn into danger faster than most people realized, and the wind already sounded stronger than it had a few minutes earlier. He carefully opened the back door of the stranded car, shielding the inside with his body so the snow would not blow directly onto the babies. The young woman stirred slightly, her eyes blinking open with the slow confusion of someone who had been fighting exhaustion for too long. For a moment she seemed unsure whether Ethan was real or just another shape moving in the storm. Then one of the babies gave a soft cry, and she tightened her arms protectively around them. Ethan kept his voice calm and steady, the way he used to speak to his daughter when she woke from bad dreams during winter storms. "You are going to be all right," he said gently. "But we need to get out of this car right now." The woman tried to speak, but her voice came out thin and shaky. I did not know where else to go." Her words trembled in the freezing air. Ethan leaned closer, careful not to crowd her or frighten her. Up close he could see how pale she looked, how the edges of the blanket were stiff with frozen snow. The babies were bundled tightly, their tiny faces barely visible beneath knitted caps that looked far too thin for a night like this. "My truck is right behind us," Ethan said. "It is warm and it runs strong. Let me help you." The woman hesitated, her eyes moving between Ethan and the storm outside, as if measuring whether she could trust him. Then the wind pushed another hard gust across the highway, rocking the car slightly, and that seemed to make the decision for her. She nodded faintly. Ethan moved with careful precision, the same steady patience he used when repairing delicate engines at the garage. He took one of the newborn twins first, cradling the tiny bundle against his chest so the wind could not reach her. The baby weighed almost nothing, yet the responsibility felt enormous. The small child made a quiet whimper, but quickly settled as Ethan held her securely. He stepped through the snow toward the pickup truck, boots sinking several inches with every step. The blizzard swallowed sound and distance so completely that the truck headlights looked like distant lanterns even though they were only 20 feet away. Ethan opened the passenger door and gently placed the baby inside, where the warm air from the heater flowed steadily across the seat. The warmth seemed to comfort the child almost immediately. When he returned to the car, the young woman had managed to lift the second baby, but her arms trembled with fatigue. Ethan helped guide her out of the vehicle, keeping one arm steady around her shoulder as they moved slowly through the blowing snow. Each step looked difficult for her, as though the storm had drained the last of her strength. When they finally reached the truck, Ethan helped her climb carefully into the passenger seat beside the first baby. The heater hummed softly, filling the cab with blessed warmth. For several seconds, none of them spoke. The young woman looked down at the twins resting in her lap, her eyes shining with relief and disbelief. Then she looked up at Ethan as he settled behind the wheel. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "My name is Lily," she said quietly, "and I think you just saved our lives." Ethan kept the truck moving slowly through the blizzard, both hands steady on the steering wheel as the narrow road stretched ahead in pale ribbons beneath the headlights. The heater hummed stronger now, pushing warm air across the cab while snow continued to swirl outside the windows like restless ghosts moving through the dark. Lily sat quietly in the passenger seat with the twins resting carefully in her arms, their tiny faces finally beginning to relax as the warmth reached them. One of the babies stirred and made a soft, sleepy sound that almost sounded like relief. Ethan glanced toward them briefly before returning his eyes to the road. "There is a small cabin about 12 miles from here," he said in a calm voice. "It is not much, but it is warm and safe." Lily nodded slowly, still looking down at the children as if she could not quite believe they were no longer out in the storm. The truck rolled forward another mile before Ethan spoke again, his tone gentle but curious. "How long were you out there?" Lily hesitated before answering. Her voice was quiet, almost fragile. "Since late afternoon. The car stopped working, and I tried to keep the engine going, but it finally died." She swallowed and pulled the blanket a little tighter around the babies. "I thought someone would come eventually, but the storm kept getting worse." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. He had seen enough winter breakdowns to understand how quickly situations could turn dangerous once temperatures dropped. Outside, the wind still rattled the truck, but the warm cab felt like another world compared to the frozen highway they had left behind. After a few moments, Lily spoke again, almost as if the silence itself had encouraged her. "Their names are Ava and Nora," she said softly, looking down at the twins. One of the babies opened her eyes briefly before drifting back into sleep. Ethan smiled faintly at the sight. "Those are beautiful names," he said. "My daughter will like them." Lily looked up slightly. "You have a daughter?" Ethan nodded. "Emily. She is 8 years old, and she has been asking for a little sister since she was 5. The thought made him chuckle quietly. "I keep telling her life does not work that way, but she has not stopped hoping." Lily listened to that with an expression that seemed both tired and grateful. The truck continued down the lonely road until finally a small line of dark trees appeared through the falling snow. Ethan turned onto a narrow gravel path almost hidden beneath drifts of white. At the end of the short drive, a modest wooden cabin stood beside a row of cottonwood trees, its porch light glowing softly against the storm. Ethan parked the truck and stepped out first, brushing snow from his coat before opening the passenger door. Warm light spilled from the cabin windows behind him. Lily looked toward the small house with quiet disbelief. "You live here?" she asked. Ethan nodded simply. "It is not fancy, but it keeps the wind out." Inside the cabin, a small fire crackled in the wood stove, and the scent of pine and cinnamon drifted through the warm air. The door to the hallway creaked open, and a small girl with dark hair appeared sleepily in oversized pajamas. Emily Walker blinked once at the unexpected sight of her father carrying a newborn baby inside the house, then looked at the second baby in Lily's arms. For a moment the room became very still. Then Emily whispered the one thing no one expected her to say. "Daddy, did the storm bring them here?" Emily stood in the doorway rubbing sleep from her eyes, her small voice hanging gently in the warm air of the cabin as the wind continued to whisper outside the walls. Ethan paused for a moment, holding one of the newborn twins carefully in his arms, and a quiet smile touched his face despite the long night behind him. "Something like that," he said softly. Emily stepped closer, her curiosity quickly replacing the last traces of sleep. The light from the wood stove flickered across the room, reflecting in her wide eyes as she looked at the tiny baby bundled in her father's coat. Lily remained near the door for a moment, uncertain whether she should step further inside, but the warmth of the cabin wrapped around her like a promise she had not felt in hours. Ethan gently set the baby into a small basket beside the couch, where extra blankets were folded neatly. The other twin rested peacefully in Lily's arms, her breathing slow and steady now that the cold had been replaced by warmth. Emily moved closer and leaned carefully beside the basket, studying the newborn face with quiet amazement. "She is really small," Emily whispered, as though speaking too loudly might wake her. Ethan chuckled softly. "Most newborns are." Lily finally stepped forward, her voice still fragile but warmer than before. "Her name is Ava," she said, glancing toward the baby in the basket. "And the one I am holding is Nora." Emily repeated the names slowly, as if committing them to memory. "Ava and Nora," she said, smiling gently. "They sound like sisters from a storybook." Ethan added another log to the wood stove, and the fire responded with a brighter glow that filled the cabin with soft golden light. The small house had always been quiet, especially since the long months after Emily's mother passed away, but tonight something felt different. The soft breathing of the newborns, the crackle of the fire, and the faint whistle of wind outside created a new rhythm inside the cabin. Ethan brought a warm mug of tea to Lily and motioned toward the couch. "You should sit," he said kindly. "You have had a long night." Lily lowered herself slowly onto the couch, still holding Nora, close as if afraid the moment might disappear if she let go. Emily climbed beside her carefully, leaving enough space so the babies would remain comfortable. For a while no one spoke. The quiet inside the cabin felt peaceful instead of lonely. Finally Ethan looked toward Lily with gentle concern. "Where were you trying to go tonight?" he asked. Lily stared into the fire for a moment before answering. Her eyes carried a weight that seemed older than the storm itself. "Anywhere they could not find us," she said quietly. Ethan did not press further, sensing that whatever story lived behind those words needed time before it could be spoken. Emily looked between the adults with the simple wisdom only children sometimes have. She leaned a little closer to the twins and whispered softly to them, as if sharing a secret. "Do not worry," she said gently. "Our house is very good at keeping storms outside." The words lingered in the warm room, and for the first time since the blizzard began, Lily allowed herself to believe that maybe the storm had brought her to the one place she needed to be. Morning arrived quietly over Pine Hollow as the blizzard slowly loosened its grip on the valley. Pale winter light filtered through the cabin windows, turning the snow outside into a wide field of silver and blue. Inside the small house the fire in the wood stove had burned low during the night, but the warmth still lingered in the wooden walls and the soft blankets spread across the couch. Ethan woke first, as he usually did, his body still trained by years of early mornings at the garage. For a moment he simply listened. The cabin no longer sounded empty the way it often had since the difficult years after Emily's mother passed away. Now there were new sounds layered into the quiet morning. The soft breathing of sleeping infants, the gentle creak of the floorboards as the house settled, the faint hum of wind moving through the cottonwood trees outside. Ethan stepped quietly into the living room and paused when he saw the scene before him. Lily had fallen asleep on the couch sometime during the night, one arm wrapped protectively around Nora while Ava rested in the small basket near the fireplace. Emily sat cross-legged on the rug beside them, still wearing her pajamas, carefully watching the babies as if she had been guarding them for hours. When she noticed her father, she smiled in the soft morning light. "They woke up earlier," she whispered proudly, "but I helped keep them warm." Ethan's heart warmed at the sight. He knelt beside her and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You did a good job," he said quietly. Emily leaned closer to the basket, and studied Ava again with fascinated attention. "They are really quiet now," she whispered. "Maybe the storm made them sleepy." Ethan chuckled softly under his breath. Across the room, Lily stirred slowly, waking with the cautious awareness of someone who had spent many nights without knowing where she would end up next. For a brief second, confusion crossed her face, but then she saw the fire, the blankets, and the two babies safe beside her. Relief washed over her expression like the first warm sunlight after a long winter night. Ethan stood and offered her a gentle smile. "Good morning," he said. Lily sat up carefully, adjusting the blanket around Nora. "Good morning," she answered softly, her voice still touched by disbelief. Ethan moved toward the small kitchen and poured warm coffee into a mug before handing it to her. The simple act seemed to mean more than words could explain. For several minutes, they sat quietly, while Emily continued watching the babies as though the world had suddenly given her the little sisters she had always imagined. Finally, Ethan spoke again, his voice calm but thoughtful. "You are welcome to stay here for a while," he said, "until the roads are clear and you decide where you want to go next." Lily held the mug in both hands, absorbing the warmth before answering. Her eyes moved toward Ava and Nora, then back to Ethan. There was something unspoken behind her expression, something deeper than exhaustion. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You have already done more for us than anyone else has." Outside, the storm clouds were beginning to break apart, revealing small patches of blue sky above the snow-covered valley. But inside the cabin, something else was beginning too. A quiet feeling that the strange night that had brought them together might only be the beginning of a story none of them had expected. The day unfolded slowly across Pine Hollow as sunlight finally spread over the deep blankets of snow that the blizzard had left behind. From the cabin windows, the valley looked peaceful again, the wind now nothing more than a quiet whisper moving through the cottonwood trees. Inside the small house, the warmth of the fire and the steady rhythm of everyday life began to return. Ethan spent the late morning clearing a narrow path from the porch to the driveway with a snow shovel, each careful movement sending small clouds of powder drifting into the air. It was hard work, but he welcomed it. After the long winter night, simple routines felt grounding. When he finally stepped back inside, brushing snow from his jacket, he heard something unexpected coming from the living room. Soft laughter. It had been a long time since that sound had filled the cabin so easily. Emily sat on the floor with a stack of folded blankets beside her, carefully arranging them into what she proudly called a baby nest. Ava rested peacefully in the center while Nora lay beside Lily on the couch, both babies wrapped in thick quilts that Ethan had once stored away for colder months. Lily watched Emily with a quiet smile that carried both gratitude and wonder. "She is very good with them," Lily said gently when Ethan stepped into the room. Ethan nodded, leaning against the doorway for a moment as he watched his daughter move around the babies with careful attention. "Emily has always liked taking care of things," he said. Emily looked up proudly. "They like it here," she announced with complete confidence. "Ava blinked at me twice, which means she agrees." Ethan laughed softly and moved toward the kitchen where a small pot of soup warmed on the stove. He poured 3 bowls and set them carefully on the table. The simple meal filled the cabin with the comforting smell of herbs and vegetables. Lily joined him at the table after settling Nora back beside her sister. For a few quiet minutes, they ate in peaceful silence while Emily occasionally peeked toward the babies as if she had been given an important responsibility. Eventually, Ethan spoke again, his voice thoughtful but kind. "The roads into town should be open by tomorrow afternoon if the plows get through the main highway," he said. "If you need supplies or a place to contact someone, the town is about 15 miles south." Lily listened carefully, her fingers wrapped around the warm bowl in front of her. "Thank you," she said softly. "But there is no one I can call right now." Ethan did not question her further. There was something in the way she spoke that suggested the answer was not simple. Outside, the afternoon sun reflected brightly across the snowfields, sending golden light through the cabin windows. Inside the small house, the babies slept peacefully, their tiny breaths steady and calm. Emily eventually curled up on the rug beside them, resting her head on her arms as though guarding their dreams. Ethan stood near the window for a moment watching the quiet valley. Life had been simple and predictable for many years, just work at the garage and raising his daughter one steady day at a time. But now, With two newborn twins sleeping beside the fire and a stranger finding refuge in his home, something had shifted. The cabin no longer felt like a place that had been waiting for something to happen. It felt like the beginning of a story still unfolding. The following days settled into a quiet rhythm that felt almost natural, as though the small cabin had always been meant to hold 5 people instead of 2. Snow still covered the valley outside, but the skies had cleared into a wide winter blue, and sunlight poured through the frosted windows each morning. Ethan returned to the garage in town during the day once the roads reopened, leaving early before the sun climbed over the hills. Every evening, when his old pickup rolled back into the driveway, he was greeted by something he had not expected to find in his life again: laughter. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled steadily, and Emily often ran to the door before he could even knock the snow from his boots. The twins quickly became the center of everything. Ava had a calmness about her that seemed almost thoughtful for someone so small, while Nora made soft, curious sounds whenever Emily leaned close to talk to her. Lily helped with the house and the babies while Ethan worked long hours, but there was always a quiet tension in her eyes that never completely faded. Sometimes Ethan would notice her standing by the window, looking toward the distant road that led out of the valley, as if part of her still expected something to appear there. One evening after supper, Emily lay on the rug beside the twins, gently rocking the basket with her small hand. "They are smiling more now," she said happily. "That means they like living here." Ethan sat in the wooden chair near the fire, watching the scene with a thoughtful expression. "Most people like places where they feel safe," he said quietly. Lily looked down at the babies in her arms, her voice soft but distant. "Safe is something I have not felt for a long time." The room fell into a quiet pause after those words. Ethan did not ask questions, but something in Lily's tone told him that her story was deeper than she had shared. Later that night, after Emily had gone to bed and the twins were asleep again, Lily stood near the kitchen table, holding a folded piece of paper. Her hands trembled slightly, as if the decision she was about to make carried more weight than anyone could see. Ethan noticed her hesitation and walked closer. "Is everything all right?" he asked gently. Lily looked up at him, and for the first time since the storm her eyes carried something that looked like both gratitude and sorrow at the same time. "You gave my daughters warmth when the world was freezing around us," she said quietly. "You gave them a home when we had nowhere left to go." Ethan shook his head slightly. Anyone would have done the same. Lily did not answer that right away. She simply looked toward the hallway where Emily slept peacefully and toward the basket where Ava and Nora rested beside the fire. After a long moment, she placed the folded paper on the table. "Not everyone would have," she said softly. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees again, but this time the sound felt less like a warning and more like the quiet turning of something inevitable. And although no one in the cabin realized it yet, the decision Lily was making that night would soon change the course of all their lives. The night after Lily placed the folded paper on the table felt unusually quiet inside the small cabin. The fire in the wood stove had burned low, and the warm light across the room moved slowly as the flames settled into soft orange embers. Ethan stepped outside briefly to bring in another armful of firewood, the cold winter air brushing across his face as he opened the door. The sky above Pine Hollow had cleared completely now, revealing a wide field of stars that seemed brighter than usual against the deep mountain darkness. Snow still covered everything for miles, but the storm had long since passed. When Ethan stepped back inside, he noticed something strange right away. The folded paper Lily had left on the table was still there, but the chair where she had been sitting was empty. At first, he thought she might have stepped into the hallway to check on the babies or to speak softly with Emily before bedtime. But when he walked toward the living room, he saw the basket near the fire where Ava and Nora slept peacefully, wrapped in the same warm blankets Emily had carefully arranged earlier that evening. The babies were still there. Lily was not. Ethan paused beside the basket, his brow tightening slightly with quiet concern. He looked toward the hallway and spoke softly so he would not wake the twins. "Lily." The cabin answered with nothing but the gentle crackle of the wood stove. A moment later, Emily stepped sleepily into the room, rubbing her eyes. "Daddy," she whispered. Ethan turned toward her with a calm expression, though a question had already begun forming in his mind. "Did Lily say anything to you tonight?" Emily shook her head slowly. "She kissed Ava and Nora goodnight, and then she looked at me for a long time. the little girl said softly. I thought maybe she was just tired. Ethan nodded quietly, then reached for the folded paper on the table. The letter had been written in careful handwriting that looked as though each word had been chosen with great thought. Ethan read it slowly while Emily waited beside him, holding onto the edge of his sleeve. The letter explained only what Lily felt she could say. She wrote that the storm had brought her daughters to a place of kindness she had never expected to find. She wrote that Ethan had given them warmth, safety, and something far more valuable than shelter. But there were still people in the world who would continue searching for her, people who would not stop until they found where she had gone. She believed that staying might bring trouble to the quiet valley that had already given her daughters so much. And so she had left before sunrise, hoping that distance would protect the small home that had welcomed her when she needed it most. Emily looked up anxiously when Ethan finished reading. Is she coming back? She asked. Ethan folded the letter carefully and placed it back on the table. He knelt beside his daughter and gently brushed her hair away from her face. I do not know, he answered honestly. Emily looked toward the basket where the twins slept, their tiny breaths steady in the warm room. But the babies are still here, she said quietly. Ethan followed her gaze. The firelight flickered softly across Ava and Nora as they slept peacefully beside each other, unaware that their lives had just changed in a way no one inside the cabin fully understood yet. Ethan rested his hand lightly on the edge of the basket and spoke in the same calm voice he had used on the stormy highway days earlier. Then I guess that means they are not alone. The days that followed began quietly, but the quiet was different now. The small cabin that once held only 2 people slowly reshaped itself around 3 children instead of 1. Ava and Nora grew stronger with each passing week, their tiny cries slowly turning into curious sounds that filled the rooms with life. Emily took her new role as big sister with complete seriousness, often sitting beside the twins and reading simple storybooks aloud even though they were far too young to understand the words. She believed the sound of stories mattered anyway. Ethan returned to his steady routine at the garage in town, working long hours repairing engines and saving every dollar he could. But every evening when he stepped through the cabin door, the sight waiting for him reminded him that life had quietly shifted into something far larger than he had planned. 3 small girls now lived under his roof, and somehow the house felt fuller instead of heavier. Winters slowly softened into early spring across Pine Hollow. Snow melted from the valley in long silver streams that ran through the fields, and the cottonwood trees began showing the first hints of green. Inside the cabin, the twins learned to laugh, small bubbling sounds that often made Emily laugh with them. Ethan sometimes stood in the doorway after work, simply watching the 3 girls together, amazed by how naturally the family had formed. Months passed, then years. Ava and Nora grew into bright, curious children who followed Emily everywhere through the woods and across the wide, open meadow behind the cabin. They called Ethan Dad, long before anyone had planned for that word to happen. The first time Ava said it, Ethan had paused in the doorway as though the world had gently surprised him. Emily simply smiled as if she had always known it would happen that way. The letter Lily left behind remained folded inside Ethan's desk drawer. He never spoke badly about her, and he never erased the truth that somewhere in the world their mother existed. Instead, he raised the girls with the same quiet promise he had made that snowy night beside the highway. They would never feel alone. One warm afternoon several years later, the valley was alive with the sounds of spring birds and running water when Ethan sat on the wooden steps of the cabin watching the girls play in the grass. Emily, now older and taller, chased the twins through the meadow while their laughter carried easily across the open land. Ava suddenly stopped and turned toward Ethan, her face bright with excitement. Dad, she called out, waving her arms for him to watch. She spun in a clumsy circle as though dancing with the wind itself. Nora followed, giggling as she tried to copy her sister's spinning steps. Ethan leaned back slightly on the porch rail, smiling quietly as the late afternoon sun painted the valley in soft gold. In that simple moment, the truth became clear in a way no letter or explanation ever could. The storm that once threatened 3 fragile lives had instead delivered something unexpected into his world. Not a burden, not a complication, a miracle. And sometimes miracles did not arrive with thunder or bright light. Sometimes they arrived wrapped in blankets, carried through a blizzard, and placed gently into the arms of someone who never knew they had been waiting for them all along.